Welcome back to the deep dive. For those just tuning in, this is Occult Archives, the part of the show where we, kind of take a magnifying glass to history's most, let's just say, infamous books.
The ones people are, a little afraid to read on their own.
Right,
A
exactly.
little too spooky.
Yeah, a little too spooky. So this time we're going deep, deep into the world of high magic with the Ritual of Transcendental Magic.
It's sometimes called just the Ritual. It's the second part of Dogma and Ritual of High Magic by Eliphas Levi. And it's episode 199 here on Occult Archives.
Yeah, episode 199. And I think our mission, really, is to decode this book. It's influenced a lot of Western esoteric thought, but it can be a bit dense.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to unpack it.
Kind of like a cheat sheet to Levi.
A cheat sheet, yeah.
All the good stuff.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so Levi's introduction, it's dramatic, right? I mean, he paints this picture of death as this unstoppable queen, right? This old queen of the world driven by our flaws. And then he introduces this idea of intelligence and love personified as these two little children that are, pushing back against this tide.
Yeah, it's like a cosmic battle playing out.
Yeah, it's very allegorical, isn't it?
It is, very much so.
But one of the things that I found interesting right off the bat was his take on death itself. I mean, he doesn't present it as this final end, this annihilation, but more like a transition.
Like a metamorphosis, like death is just changing into something else.
Yeah.
And he connects that idea, actually, to human reason. He uses this phrase, the word of man, and says it's a force that can resist this seemingly unstoppable march of death. And that when our will, our human will aligns with the word of nature, that's where true power comes from. And he even suggests that, people who die without understanding this word of reason sort of missed out on a chance for eternal hope. It's a very hopeful way of looking at something that's usually kind of bleak.
Yeah, very different from the traditional kind of fire and brimstone, end of times.
Right, exactly.
So then he jumps into this, this big figure, Lucifer.
Oh, yeah.
And obviously that's going to raise some eyebrows, but Levi, he doesn't go the typical route, right? He doesn't portray Lucifer as the fallen angel, the embodiment of evil. Instead, he calls him the angel who enlightens, who regenerates by fire.
Yeah, he actually compares him to a comet.
A comet, right?
Which is interesting because he contrasts that with these mild stars, which I think represent conventional forces or traditional thinking. But the comet, it doesn't follow the rules. It comes in and it shakes things up. It brings change and it brings light.
Disruptive, almost.
Yeah, disruptive.
But necessary.
Necessary, yeah, exactly.
And so, I mean, that's a huge departure, isn't it, from how we usually think of Lucifer?
It really is. And I think it shows how much Levi was influenced by Kabbalistic thought, Hermetic traditions, these ideas where symbols and figures, they have these multiple layers of meaning. They're not just good or evil, black or white.
Yeah, it's all about nuance.
Nuance, exactly.
Yeah. So how does that, I mean, thinking about Lucifer in this way, how does that change how we might approach other occult symbols, do you think?
Well, it makes you question the assumptions, doesn't it? I mean, are we so quick to label something as simply good or evil? Are we missing the deeper meaning, the other sides of the story?
Absolutely. And then he moves on to another kind of controversial figure, the serpent in Genesis. And again, he kind of throws a curveball. He looks at the common translation, of course, but then he brings in Fabre d'Olivet's interpretation. And then he presents his own explanation, which is, based in Kabbalah.
Yeah, he uses the Hebrew word nahash.
Nahash, yeah.
And breaks it down using tarot symbolism.
Which is fascinating.
It is. So Nun, the first letter, represents the power of combinations. And then he is like this receptive force, this thing that gives form. So he's basically using these different systems, the Kabbalah, the tarot, as tools to unlock what he sees as these hidden layers of meaning within the Bible.
It's like he's almost saying, look, there's more to this story than meets the eye.
Right. The serpent isn't just about temptation. It's about knowledge. It's about the power of creation itself.
Okay, so let's get into the more practical side of things. The first chapter of the ritual, it's all about preparations for actually doing magic. Right.
And Levi doesn't mince words here. He says that to perform a miracle, you need to be in, well, let's just say an extraordinary state.
Right, you need to be outside the norm. He says either you've got to be super wise,
Enlightened.
Yeah, enlightened, or, and this is the interesting part, or you've got to be kind of mad. Not crazy, crazy, but like, detached from normal passions. Above it all,
Yeah.
transcendent.
Yeah, and he makes this kind of this bold statement that a magician's power is actually inversely proportional to their material desires. So the more you want stuff, the less powerful you are.
Yeah. You got to be detached. You got to be pure. And he lays out all these qualities that are essential for the magician.
Like what?
Okay, so you got to be impassive,
Impassive.
sober, chaste, disinterested, impenetrable.
This is a tall order.
It is a tall order. Oh, and also free from prejudice and terror. So yeah, basically you have to be, a saint.
A saint, yeah.
Or a very disciplined person. So it's not just about like waving a wand and things magically appearing, right? There's this inner work that's required.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's not about, getting rich or anything like that. It's about spiritual development.
Right. So then he goes into this idea of magical equilibrium in the next chapter.
Right.
And this is all about balance, isn't it?
Balance, yeah. He talks about how you need to use these opposing forces, like warmth and cold, love and anger, You got to alternate between them to stay empowered, to keep things in check.
So it's not about suppressing one or the other. It's about finding that middle ground.
Yeah. It's like you know how he describes it? He uses this really odd analogy of coquettes.
Coquettes.
Yeah, those charming women who keep their admirers on their toes.
Right, they play hot and cold.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does that, that seems a little out of place, doesn't it?
Well, it is a strange analogy. But I think what he's getting at is that, you can't just be all lovey-dovey or all angry all the time.
You'll burn yourself out.
Yeah, you'll burn yourself out, you'll lose your balance.
So you got to keep things moving, keep things dynamic.
Dynamic, yeah, exactly. It's all about maintaining that center point.
Okay, that makes sense. Then we come to the Triangle of Pentacles, where he introduces this idea of the number 3, the triad, as being like really important in magic.
Yeah, it's fundamental to magical doctrine.
Yeah.
And he talks about how it symbolizes realization and effect. And he even mentions the Hebrew letter Shin, which is associated with fire and divine presence in the Kabbalah, and how it's traced on pentacles to help fulfill desires.
Okay.
Oh, and there's this medieval representation of the triad that he mentions, this goat holding a torch.
A goat.
Yeah. We see that goat imagery popping up a lot, as we go through the book.
So it seems pretty significant.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Then we get to the conjuration of the 4.
This is where he introduces the 4 elemental kingdoms.
Right. Gnomes, salamanders, sylphs, and undines.
Yeah. And he connects each one to a cardinal direction, north, south, east, west.
And an element, right. Earth, fire, air, and water.
Exactly. And he links them to the 4 classical temperaments too.
Oh.
Melancholy, sanguine, phlegmatic, and bilious.
Oh, right.
He also gives them each an astrological sign and a ruling spirit, like Gob for the gnomes and Jinn for the salamanders.
Really specific.
Yeah, very specific.
Okay, so, are we supposed to be, like, conjuring these beings? Is that what he's saying?
Well, he does touch on divination, the arts of divination that are associated with each element. But then he kind of throws us a curveball. He warns against relying too much on divination.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. He says it can actually weaken your will.
Okay. Why would that be?
Well, I think he sees it as, if you're constantly looking to the future, trying to predict what's going to happen, you're not really taking control of your own destiny.
You're letting fate decide.
Exactly.
Okay, so even though he's laying out all this, information about these beings, he's also saying, hey, be careful, don't get too caught up in trying to control things.
Right. Use your own judgment. Use your own will.
Got it. Okay, so the blazing pentagram, another huge symbol that Levi talks about.
Right. He calls it the sign of intellectual omnipotence.
Intellectual omnipotence. Okay.
Yeah. And the word made flesh. So it's a big deal. But what's interesting is how its meaning changes depending on which way it's pointing.
So there's an upward pointing pentagram.
Yeah, that's the one we usually see. It represents order, divinity,
The good stuff.
The good stuff, yeah. But then there's the downward pointing pentagram.
Yeah.
And that's associated with intellectual subversion, like going against the grain.
Kind of rebellious.
Yeah. And it's connected to, some more, let's say, controversial figures, like the accursed goat of Mendez and Lucifer and Lilith.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's the same symbol, but with these completely opposite meanings.
Exactly. It all depends on how you use it. or how you interpret it, I guess.
So intention matters.
Intention matters, yeah.
Okay, and then there's the medium and mediator chapter where he talks about the idea of the devil, but he presents it in a way that I wasn't really expecting.
Yeah, he doesn't really believe in a personal devil, like a singular being.
Right.
Instead, he talks about this misdirected force, this odic or magnetic current that's formed by negative wills.
Almost like a collective negative energy.
Yeah, like, all the bad vibes in the world, all the bad intentions, they kind of come together and form this current. And he uses the example of the legion of demons in the Gospels and the allegory of the swine being driven into the sea.
Yeah.
So it's like all these inferior instincts are being overwhelmed by this negative energy.
So it's not so much a conscious entity, but more like a force of nature almost.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay. Now we get into the really practical stuff with chapter 7, the septenary of talismans, and this is where he gets into the details of, ceremonies, vestments, perfumes, all these symbolic characters that are used in magic.
Right. And he emphasizes that these rituals, they're not just, made up on the spot.
They have a purpose.
Yeah, they're based on these ancient laws of analogy and correspondence. He did a lot of research into grimoires,
Like old magical textbooks.
Yeah, exactly. He even had some that were like handwritten manuscripts.
Yeah.
So he was really, he was really digging deep into the history of magical practice.
That's pretty cool. So give me some examples. What are some of these specific rituals he talks about?
Okay, so he has this whole section on magical operations for each day of the week.
Each day of the week.
Yeah. So Sunday, it's ruled by the sun. So you wear a certain color vestment, you'd use certain metals, certain perfumes, even certain types of wreaths and rings, and you'd have specific talismans associated with the sun.
Like a magical recipe book.
Yeah, kind of. And then Monday's the moon, Tuesday's Mars, and so on.
So it's all about harnessing the energy of that particular day.
Exactly.
Okay. And then he goes into detail about how to create and consecrate pantacles and talismans, right?
Right.
Tell me about that. What's involved?
So you have to use specific materials, parchment or paper or metals or precious stones.
Okay.
And then you inscribe them with the symbols of the planet that you're working with.
Like the pentagram, for example.
Right, the pentagram, the seal of Solomon.
Okay.
And there are all these little details, like you have to keep the talismans in silken bags. And you have to be careful about who touches them, depending on the planetary association.
So it's very specific, very intricate.
Yeah, very meticulous.
Okay. Now, this is interesting. He also talks about blessed objects from religion, right? Like metals.
Yeah, like metals and Agnus Dei. He considers those to be true talismans, too.
So is he saying that religious objects and magical talismans are basically the same thing?
I think he's saying that they work on similar principles.
Okay, so it's all about intention and belief.
Intention, belief, yeah. And the power of symbols.
Right. Okay, so he also goes into detail about the key magical instruments, the wand, the sword, and the lamp.
Yeah, he gets really specific about how they should be made.
Like what kind of wood for the wand?
Right. He says almond or hazelwood, and it should have magnetized iron in it, or prisms, and copper, and zinc rings, and specific engravings.
Sounds very elaborate.
It is very elaborate.
And what about the sword?
The sword has to be made of pure steel, and the shape of the hilt is important. It should have the signs of the macrocosm and the microcosm on it, and the Hebrew monogram of the Archangel Michael.
Wow.
Yeah. And the lamp is also very specific. It's supposed to be made of 4 different metals, and it has to have these certain shapes and components. The seal of Hermes, the sign of Solomon, even a revolving pillar. It's like a magical machine.
Okay, so it's not as simple as just, finding any old stick and calling it a wand.
No.
There's a real art to this.
There's an art, yeah. And he stresses the importance of keeping these instruments secret.
So great.
Yeah, he says they shouldn't be seen or touched by anyone who's not initiated.
Okay, so there's a real sense of sacredness around these objects.
Absolutely.
Then we get to chapter 8, which is a warning, isn't it? A warning to the imprudent.
Right. It's like he's saying, hey, this stuff is powerful. Don't mess around with it.
Yeah, he's really serious about the dangers of engaging in magic without the proper preparation.
Right.
He warns about madness and physical ailments.
He specifically says that, nervous people, women, young people, anyone who lacks self-control, they should really stay away from magic.
It's not for the faint of heart.
No, it's not.
And he stresses that it's not a hobby,
No, it's a serious commitment.
a lifestyle almost.
Yeah, almost.
Yeah.
And he also warns against, showing off your powers.
Like trying to impress people?
Yeah, he says that can backfire.
Yeah.
And he even gives examples of magi who divulged their secrets and paid the price.
So humility is important.
Humility, discretion, yeah.
Okay, and then he advises people to live a relatively retired life.
Yeah, he says you don't have to be a hermit,
Right.
but you should have another occupation besides magic, to keep you grounded.
Okay, so balance is key.
Balance is always key with Levi.
Right. The ceremonial of initiates is interesting. It explains that that rituals are basically a way to train your will.
Yeah, they're like exercises for your willpower.
And that eventually, if you become a true adept, you don't need them anymore. Which is an interesting idea. And then he talks about the initiations in ancient temples, like in Thebes and Memphis, and how they were these really intense, sometimes scary trials.
Yeah, designed to test your obedience.
Your obedience, your limits.
Yeah, your limits.
He even mentions the long silence that Pythagoras' disciples had to observe.
Right, years of silence. So, I mean, initiation was not a joke.
Definitely not a walk in the park. Okay, then we get to the key of occultism.
Oh, this is a good one.
It is, and it's where he introduces this image of a winged dragon dominated by the triangle.
Which he says represents the Christ of Kunrath.
The Christ of Kunra.
Yeah, a mystic and alchemist from the 16th century.
Okay.
And it also represents the secret of the pentagram, the sovereign intelligence of light and life.
Wow, that's a lot packed into one image.
It is, yeah. And then he talks about these Kabbalistic figures that were supposedly given to Nicholas Flamel, the famous alchemist.
Right, Flamel.
He says they're like the 22 keys of the tarot,
Okay.
and that they resemble the 12 keys of Basil Valentine, another alchemist.
So there's a connection between all these different traditions.
No, he's drawing these parallels.
And then he goes into detail about the symbolism of the 12th and 22nd tarot keys, the Hanged Man and the World,
Right.
and how they reveal the grand work.
The grand work, yeah, which is like, the ultimate goal of alchemy.
Transformation.
Transformation, exactly.
Okay, then in the triple chain, he tells this story about a friend of his who tried to do alchemy and failed.
Yeah, he contrasts that with figures like Raymond Lully and Nicholas Flamel, who were successful.
The legends.
The legends, yeah.
And he suggests that their secret is hidden in symbols, and that he's trying to reveal it.
He's giving us the keys?
Yeah, he's like, here's how to crack the code.
Exactly.
Okay, so then we get to the chapter on the great work. And he emphasizes that any magical evocations, you should only do them for a good reason.
Right, for love or intelligence.
Not just out of curiosity.
No, not out of curiosity.
And then he goes into these detailed procedures for evoking love.
Yeah, it's like a step-by-step guide.
What are some of the things you have to do?
Well, you have to collect memorials of the person you're trying to attract, like pictures and letters and things.
Okay.
And then you prepare a room that's similar to theirs, like with their favorite colors and furniture.
Okay.
And you have a veiled portrait of them with their favorite flowers.
Interesting.
And you choose a date that's significant to them.
Okay.
And then you abstain from certain pleasures for 2 weeks beforehand.
Okay, so there's a lot of preparation involved.
A lot of preparation, yeah. And then on the day of the evocation, you have to wear festive attire and have this symbolic meal with 2 settings, as if the person is there with you.
It's almost like you're creating this space for them to enter.
Exactly.
Okay, and then what about evocations for knowledge?
Those are even more solemn.
Okay.
You have to spend 21 days meditating on the person's life and writings and carrying their portrait or their name with you.
Okay.
And you have to follow a vegetarian diet or even fast. And you can construct this special oratory, like a small temple.
Okay.
And you control the light with prisms and lamps. And you use incense, and you pray towards the east, and you invoke towards the west.
Very specific.
Very specific, yeah.
Yeah.
And you wear special vestments and a crown.
Yeah.
And you bathe beforehand. And you begin with an appropriate prayer. He even gives some examples of prayers for different figures like Voltaire.
Oh, interesting. So you can't just use any old prayer.
No, it has to be tailored to the entity you're trying to contact.
Okay, and he also gives this warning about names like Satan.
Yeah, he says they represent legions of impure spirits.
And this idea of an inverse progression in hell.
Right.
Where people think they're going up, they're actually going down.
Yeah, it's like a spiritual trap.
Okay. Then we get to necromancy. Yeah, this is where things get a little dark.
Yeah, he talks about the practices of Thessalian sorcerers and medieval necromancers.
The ones who, dig up graves and use body parts and stuff.
Yeah, really nasty stuff. He says they used poisonous ingredients and evoked the dead in graveyards.
That's pretty intense.
It is. And he stresses that black magic is all about, disturbing reason and causing harm.
Making people do bad things.
Yeah.
And he references some pretty infamous grimoires, like the Grand Grimoire.
Which has that recipe for the composition of death.
Right, which is just, super creepy.
Super creepy, yeah.
And he actually describes this necromantic process, but he warns against trying it.
Oh, yeah. Definitely don't try that at home.
Okay. Then there's a short chapter on transmutations.
Right.
Where he basically says that even love can be twisted into something bad.
Yeah, if it starts as a form of magic, like if you're trying to manipulate someone, it can turn into sorcery.
It becomes destructive.
Destructive, yeah.
Okay.
Because it's driven by passion, not by true love.
Okay. And then we get to the Sabbath of the sorcerers.
Another creepy one.
It is. And this is where he talks about the devil, Baphomet, the goat of Mendes.
Right, which is the image on the 15th tarot card.
The devil card.
Yeah.
Okay, and he explains the symbolism of the three animals in Hermetic magic.
Right, the bull, the dog, and the goat.
And the Jewish tradition of the two goats on Yom Kippur.
Yeah, and he analyzes the symbolism of the goat in the frontispiece of his book.
Okay.
But what's interesting is that he says that Satan, as a superior power, doesn't really exist.
So it's not like this big bad guy out there.
Right.
Yeah.
He says it's more like a personification of our errors and weaknesses.
Our own darkness.
Our own darkness, yeah. And he talks about how the Manichaean heresy led to this idea of a negative deity, and how that influenced black magic practices like blood sacrifices and idolatry. And then he talks about all these different types of Sabbaths.
The witches' Sabbath.
Yeah, the witches' Sabbath.
Okay, so what are the different types?
Well, he says some of them are just, fantasies and imagination.
Okay.
But others are, they're real gatherings of adepts, but they're not like the orgies that you hear about.
Right.
He says true adepts don't do that kind of stuff.
So it's more like a spiritual gathering?
Yeah, more spiritual.
Oh, okay.
And then there are the foolish or criminal gatherings, which are basically just black magic rituals.
Okay. And then he even describes Sabbaths that are induced by potions and fumigations?
Yeah, like drug-induced hallucinations.
Right.
And he talks about the secret meetings of people who were practicing ancient pagan religions after Christianity became dominant,
So they had to hide.
Yeah, they had to hide.
Okay. And he really emphasizes that true adepts wouldn't participate in orgies.
Right, he says chastity is a magical tradition.
So it's about self-control.
Like self-control, purity.
Okay. So then we get to witchcraft and spells.
Where he gets into how sorcerers would try to use the power of true adepts for evil purposes.
Like bewitching people.
Yeah, bewitching people, cursing them.
Okay.
And he describes how a magus can even unintentionally cause harm just by disapproving of someone or even forgiving them.
This seems a little far-fetched.
It does, but he gives some examples, of people who were harmed just by the thoughts of a magus.